dir noch angesäche, so bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschäche? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary Holy Land from the heathen. This is Dan Baltic.
And this is Matt Pegas.
And this is episode 49. We are here with Max Thrax, who is not only the managing editor of Apocalypse Confidential, which is a literary magazine which focuses on to some extent noir fiction and pulp fiction, but he is also the author of a very good book, a very good novel called God is a Killer. And we are, very happy to have you here today, Max.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we came across God is a Killer and came across before I knew about your novel. I was, of course, familiar with Apocalypse Confidential, which has had a kind of like meteoric, in some sense, rise since I think you guys started in like a little over a year ago. And
we're starting year 3 right now.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah. That's
not for too long.
Okay. Well, in that case, but yes, not for too long. And you, there's like a real kind of aesthetic right now on the right that I think the e-right, whatever you want to call this side of Twitter, that emphasizes a kind of like pulp and noir like elements. You see it in Apocalypse Confidential. You see it, I think, a bit with Brendan Lusso's aesthetic. Certainly Blauer, who is, of course, the editor-in-chief of Apocalypse Confidential. And so this is a force that is kind of like shaping the aesthetic of our side. So we knew about Apocalypse Confidential. And when your novel came out, Matt had a very interesting comment, which is,
right.
Take it away, Matt.
It's almost a very flattering comment, and then I wish I could land the comment a little better, to condense it into one line, it's your book, God is a Killer, is the only book that I almost, from our scene at least, that I almost bought just based on the cover. I wish I could tell you that I did just buy it based on the cover. But, in a world with stacks of books we're reading for this podcast and stuff, and, it's not exactly like we're making bank. I don't often like just impulse buy a book, but I can't quite land the comment that I actually did purchase it. But I remember when I saw it, when did it come out? Like the end of 21 or the beginning of last year?
It came out May 27th last year.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Timelines get strange on the internet, right? You don't always, but anyway, the cover is so cool in my opinion. Just those colors, not to sound degenerate, but that inverted cross, it was all like, what is this all about? So I came very close to buying it based on the cover alone. But so it's not a fully landed, like, great story, but I have to say, it really is a very compelling cover and title. And it's a good example, like which is in our scene, I think it's a high compliment because there's so many different books, to sort through, that yours definitely stands out. And I was glad to finally get a chance to actually purchase it and read it in advance of this conversation.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. I mean, I wish I could take credit for the cover. It's amazing. Matthew Revert is the guy who did it. He's one of the top designers, kind of on the indie scene in general. I'd loved a bunch of his covers before that. So I knew I was going to get him. And on top of him just being an incredibly talented designer, we have a lot of the same tastes in common. He likes a lot of, Penguin, paperbacks from the 60s and 70s, as well as a lot of Polish poster designers. So we really got along on that level. And I told him, well, basically, you know what I like, so just do whatever you want. And I think that maybe that freed him up a little bit to do, what I think is a really incredible cover.
Yeah,
Awesome.
no,
I think
great.
at this point we should probably note that your novel was published by Close to the Bone, which is a UK publishing company that seems to, and tell me if I'm putting words in anyone's mouth, but seems to specialize in also pulp fiction of some sort.
Yeah, it specializes in, pretty hard-boiled crime fiction, as well as a bit of transgressive fiction. Not everything they published is crime, but that's always been their focus. And, it was one of the presses that I gravitated towards kind of when I got on the scene, the independent crime scene a couple of years ago. That was one of the couple of presses that I really took seriously and, thought, well, I would like to publish something with them.
Yeah, no, they're really cool. I like this, they're one of these, I guess, slightly more genre-based, but I do, as you said, I think they would publish kind of a range of different types of transgressive stuff. Very cool, aesthetic there where, it's all close to the bone, meaning sort of like, as pulp fiction does, as crime fiction does, as transgressive fiction can, really kind of fiction that gets under your skin with its language and everything. I've also read a couple other books from their roster, including friend of the pod, Gabriel Hart, also publishes with Close to the Bone, I know. So it's definitely a publishing house that our listeners should have on their radar, and I'm glad. God is a Killer would be a great place to start, I think, with Close to the Bone. But they're British based, right?
Yeah, they're based in Britain. I think the actual the office is in Rugby, and the guy who runs it, Craig Douglas, he's I believe he said he was living in a mining village in the Northeast. I'm not exactly sure where. That was part of his bio. Yeah, he's English too. And they've had a lot of really great writers over the years. I mean, right now Gabriel's on there, and also one of my favorite books of last year, Blood Trip by Jesse Hilson.
Oh, right.
Okay,
Yeah. Jesse, we know Jesse somewhat.
Yeah, another noir book. So
yeah, I should read that. Yeah, Jesse's cool, and what was I going to say? Something about Close to the Bone.
So UK, it's an interesting thing about UK publishers, because I remember before I, even was shopping Nutcracker around, that's my debut novel, to anyone, and I was just kind of thinking like, and before I was even really, before New Right was a thing, before I was on the E-Right, whatever that means, I was figuring out, I wrote Nutcracker, how to get it published. And so I was talking to a professor from my college who's a well-known literary fiction author, and he kind of co-signed on the issues in literary fiction, mainstream literary fiction today, which are, men such as myself are not going to be very easily published. And so he recommended reaching out to UK agents and British small presses. And so I wonder, this seems to give credence to what he said. I mean, that wasn't what I did. I reached out to Matt Forney and got it published by Terror House, which I'm very happy with. But I do wonder, was your experience with like a UK press, are they a little more based, shall we say?
I mean, Craig's pretty based. I mean, if you look at the logo, you can see what Close to the Bone is all about. I mean, you don't really need to see any more than that. But it wasn't really on a political basis that, I sort of was looking at them. It was purely aesthetically. And like in general, I'm not really a political person, certainly not online. But aesthetics mean a lot to me. Literature certainly means a lot to me. And, those are sort of the things that I look for: aesthetic value, literary value. And a couple of the authors on Close to the Bone had a big impact on the way that I write. One of the first things that Craig did was a series of novellas called the Near to the Knuckle series. And there were a couple books in there. I think it was A Day in the Life of Jason Dean was one by Ian Arris, and Eye for an Eye by Paul Heatley. They were both gangster novels or novellas. And they opened up a few things for me because I didn't know you could actually write about that stuff. You don't see a lot of, for whatever reason, American authors just writing about gangland or, pretty serious urban crime. Even in noir, a lot of it is either almost like a domestic drama or, it's a rural noir, sort of like God is a Killer. And maybe I think that is a bit different over in the UK, where you still have a lot of urban crime that the writers are close to, and that, you know, maybe they grow up around.
Do you think
So that was a little bit different. And for whatever reason, a lot of them seem to come from the Northeast as well. You know,
Yeah.
Durham, Northumberland, Tyneside around Newcastle. I can name, you know, probably 3 or 4 authors just from that region. So I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just something in the water.
Yeah. I remember I almost studied
Neil?
abroad at the University of East Anglia, and yeah, I almost wish that I wound up studying in London, but I almost wish I did study there. So
Yeah. Well, that place has got a pretty strong literary pedigree.
yeah.
East Anglia. Yeah. So yeah, that was a good school. But yeah, London is, you know, you can do a lot of things in London. So,
Yeah.
It's more that.
I'm not sure I did much than get drunk.
yeah. Well, that's usually top of the list.
Yeah.
I've never been to London, but my understanding is kind of more the cosmopolitan area, obviously. But I have been to Yorkshire, so that's like northeast England, and yeah, I can see how that could breed a certain kind of similar to New England in the United States. Not New England also has its cosmopolitan areas, obviously, in sort of neoliberal modern type areas, no doubt. But there's that, I don't know. There's some, yeah, as you said, there's something in the water in certain places like I think Northern England and New England in the United States, where I don't know, it's cold, the roots run deep, and I can see how it breeds a certain kind of bleaker outlook on things, which definitely comes through in God is a Killer, but I imagine some of these English books from Close to the Bone as well.
Yeah. Well, to kind of like jump off of that, I think that's a good way to kind of find a vein into God is a Killer. And yeah, so to like jump into your novel here more deeply, it is obviously a pulp fiction of sorts, which is set in New England, and it kind of revolves around, and you know, stop me if I'm putting words in your mouth, the battle, not even metaphorical, but battle between Sheriff Fitzroy and McDougal, who is this kind of psychopathic, religious gangster who previously and still to some extent wants to reclaim a cult that he had started, a religious cult that is centered in the mansion or the house of this woman who is now trying to sell that land to a developer. And so this is kind of the context into which the reader is thrust. So everything is very much like everything's in motion. Like literally, the book starts out with a character who you introduce for a few pages, and then, well, I don't think this really ruins anything for anyone if they read more than 3 or 4 pages. He gets shot and killed by well, I guess not by McDougal, by his henchmen, but you know, essentially by McDougal. And yeah, and so it's this very you know, set up for this strong cast of characters in New England in this noir setting. And so, yeah, how did you kind of, I mean, we'll talk about some of the themes, but how did you find your way into this story? How did it start?
Well, that's a good question, because it went through, I think, a couple of different iterations before I ended up with, you know, the final product or whatever God is a Killer finally became. It did start with McDougal. He was the first character that I had, and his name was McDougal, but he wasn't a cult leader or a religious fanatic. He was it's hard to say what he was. He was kind of like an alien hunter. He believed that aliens had come down to Earth and the government had found them and performed all these experiments on them and buried their skeletons all over the country. Oh. And it was McDougal and his kind of crew of diggers who would go out with their, you know, archaeological tools and go around to these different sites and try to dig up these alien bones. And of course, McDougal was utterly convinced that this was all true. So that was the first draft that I wrote, and it didn't really get that far. But that's
great though. Like yeah, I love how like novels start out as something entirely different, but you carry on this kind of like, and that's kind of similar to my process as well. I write and write until I find a character I like, and then that character, that's what the novel will be about. So like, it sounds like maybe you kind of like wrote until you found McDougal. and then you figured out like, well, okay, this is what McDougal is going to be doing. He's not going to be digging up aliens. He's
Exactly. Yeah. I just I kept the emotional core, the spine of the character who's motivated by, anger and fanaticism and, different unpleasant emotions. So eventually he just became a religious fanatic. And I read a book about doomsday cults. It's called How the Millennium Comes Violently. It's an academic book. And just chapter by chapter, they go through the different groups, all the classic ones, Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, Aum Shinrikyo. And, I read quite a bit about the Branch Davidians. Thrax was very interesting. I took some inspiration from him and also some of the power struggles that went on in the group before he took control, because he was not the clear-cut successor to leading the Branch Davidians. He had some pretty bitter rivalries with other people in the group. So some of that lore I kind of used as a springboard for
interesting,
backstory in the book. It's very loosely paraphrased. None of it is kind of like bit for bit, but that was my inspiration for it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And that's sort of now, okay, just bring it back briefly just for 1 second to Apocalypse Confidential. That kind of theme is sort of in line with, obviously Apocalypse Confidential has the word apocalypse right in it. It's kind of like a, portmanteau of Apocalypse Confidential and LA Confidential, or Apocalypse and LA Confidential is always how I imagine it. I don't think Apocalypse Confidential shoehorns anything too much, but one of the things that I like about the site is that it kind of lays out all these different broad themes. There's in the About section, it just lays out a really interesting list of inspirations, everything from Hollywood Babylon to Looney Tunes, and just this kind of random stuff going in. So I don't really know what I'm asking here, other than to say, is that one of I know that God is a Killer is not technically published by Apocalypse Confidential, but it's published by you and as a figure involved with Apocalypse Confidential. I guess that's part of what I'm at. Is that sort of apocalyptic? Do you view that apocalyptic aesthetic as sort of part and parcel of both Apocalypse Confidential and your novel, or are they separate? Or would you identify that as a kind of preoccupation of kind of you and some of the people that you're associated with online?
It could be. I think that the novel is one of the reasons why Jacob asked me to join as fiction editor for Apocalypse Confidential, because we do have a lot of the same preoccupations, same sort of things that we like to watch or read, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So, it was huge when he asked me to join up, because without even realizing it, that was what I wanted. I wanted to be part of what he was building. That was huge for me.
Interesting. Yeah, no, not to necessarily. We'll go back to the novel more proper in a moment. But I did want to ask about that. So you kind of have been with Apocalypse Confidential from the ground up. Were you friends with Jacob beforehand?
Well, we're heading into year 3 now.
Right.
So year 1 was just Jacob by himself. Then year 2 is when I joined, and Dawson and Brendan and Tom and Hermes all joined up as editors. And we just added another one. Like Tali is now one of our editor at large. We just changed our masthead this month. This is all pretty recent.
Because I noticed you had been fiction editor, but as I'm doing the prep for this episode, I realized, you got a little promotion there.
Yeah, I did. So as with all promotions, I get to twiddle my thumbs a bit more, and let Dawson do all the work. So when I was fiction editor, I was reading all the fiction submissions. Or at least the ones that were kind of getting sent my way by Jacob and saying, yes or no, this is accepted or this is rejected. Yeah. Now that I'm managing editor, I read everything that comes in, whether it's fiction, poetry, or essays, but I don't respond to anybody. I see what's coming in, and if an editor wants a second opinion, they can ask me. Or if I think that, we passed on something that maybe, we should actually publish, I can talk to the editor in question about it. Yeah. And I help come up with the editorial schedule in general. Yeah. Very nice. Higher up role. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And it's going to be a big year for us, because this is we have a books editor now, which we didn't have last year. So we've got Bill on board. Yeah, and we've got some books coming out this year. So there will be some hard copies in people's hands.
Oh, awesome. So so Apocalypse Confidential is moving to be a press as well, and to publish.
Yeah, that was we talked about that a lot last year. And so now year 3 we're moving into the physical.
Excellent.
Media.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a natural progression. And any like lit magazine who has a brand, like, why aren't they doing that? You should be doing
Yeah.
that. So good.
Yeah, and as far as whatever influence we have over, the scene of this side, I don't really know because I think I'm just too close to it. I'm too concerned with like the nuts and bolts of being part of a Apocalypse Confidential. I'm just making sure I do a good job with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. I mean, we seem to be doing pretty well, and I think that one of the reasons why is because we're not really trying to be anything. I mean, the stuff that we publish is pretty intense, but if you see any of us online, I mean, we're pretty chill.
Yeah.
I think people just kind of respect that. It's like we're not trying to hype ourselves up too much or do things too fast or promise things that we can't deliver. So, I think that's
Yeah.
probably why people respect us.
Definitely.
I think a lot of kind of, and this is a almost at this point a tired trope on our show, but people or artists who are focusing on their art at the you know putting the art first before other ideological or political considerations, in a sense that places you on our side of Twitter regardless of like your actual political beliefs, because like in this day and age to say like I'm focusing on the art, the politics can go screw. Like that is like almost certainly in the mainstream publishing industry you have sensitivity readers, you have all of this like censors, like did you say the wrong thing? And so yeah, I think that kind of honest art, and the only good art is honest art, pretty much in my opinion. It's it comes out of our spaces, and
Right. And I
so
mean,
it's so
I'm
that's
sorry.
that's why we you're on our radar to some
Right.
extent
Exactly. Yeah.
because
And I
of that.
mean, yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to be independent at the moment because, I certainly have nothing to offer mainstream publishing at this point, which is just as well because I think mainstream publishing is probably at its lowest point ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's gotten so consolidated and overblown, and there's just not a lot of quality coming out of it. So, I mean, it's not that everything that's independent is good. I mean, certainly not, but the
I mean,
stuff that
but at
really interests
least
me
And
and
the
that I look
polls.
out for is
yeah,
coming out of independent presses. Absolutely.
at least quality notwithstanding, you at least in a independent at independent presses, you have the ability, depending on the press, of course, to write what you want to write, to say what you want to say, and that is a force in and of itself in terms of artistic quality. So, like, yeah, just a man writing, saying what he wants to say, that will have more power than the kind of like most polished kind of obfuscating story that tries to highlight and hit the right notes. Like, yeah, just a man screaming what he needs to say. That's better art right there, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that ultimately the art is what matters anyway. I mean, that's what people look at. I mean, do
Exactly.
any of our mutuals really care what Michael Mann's politics are? Like, no,
Yeah.
not really. They
Yeah.
don't
I
really
mean, I
care.
don't even know.
Yeah, but we love this stuff anyway. So yeah, it doesn't really matter. Oh, the only thing that I know how to do, or at least try to do, is just make something cool. That's it. And that's hard enough. That takes all of my energy.
Yeah, completely.
Well, speaking of making something cool, to dig back into God is a Killer, you've created this really powerful character in McDougal. And so I think the kind of the cat and mouse game between McDougal and the sheriff, it obviously is an homage to the classic pulp and noir trope of the kind of uh, battle between good versus evil on a playing field and in a world where they run into each other, and the morality becomes something that's murky and ambivalent. And so, like, yes, McDougal is like obviously the villain, and Fitzroy is the hero. But and I think this was intentionally a choice of yours. They both have sympathetic elements, and they both have villainous elements to them.
Yeah, when I started writing the book, or at least what became its final form, what you have now, I self-consciously decided that I wasn't going to try to be too original with the book. I mean, first of all, it's my debut novel, so nobody knows who I am, whatsoever. So I kind of wanted to give people something that they could recognize and, maybe sink their teeth into a little bit. So of the four sort of main characters, I mean, they're all, archetypal noir characters. Because you've got McDougal, who's, the violent religious fanatic. You've got Sarah, who's the poor little rich girl. You've got Fitzroy, who's the Jim Thompson-esque, corrupt county sheriff. And then you got Timmy, who's, the young guy who's just a little slow, maybe like Lenny. And no, I mean, not quite as slow as, Lenny and Mouse and Men, but, he's grown up in a very sheltered environment. He doesn't know a lot about the world. All he really knows is that he used to be a lot happier before McDougal left. That's his emotional touchstone.
I think that's such a fascinating choice to kind of lean into writing in terms of archetypes and writing something familiar. I think, especially in independent publishing, a lot of people do want to be original, and we all, not all of us, many of us grew up reading people like David Foster Wallace, who Dan just did a stream about, which I'll plug.
Thank you, Matt.
Where there's such that aesthetic singularity of, putting footnotes in your novel and having these sentences that are oh so recognizable. But I think there's kind of an underrated thing to make that choice to write something that people can sink their teeth into. I think it's kind of a much more level-headed take on writing, especially when you are, publishing more or less independently and it's your first novel. It's probably something that I could think more about. I think probably as a younger writer, I spent far too much time thinking like, okay, what's my voice? How am I going to stand out? How am I going to be the voice of my generation and make this statement that, is going to be utterly singular? Whereas I think there is a power, and this isn't like a backhanded compliment, because I think you can start from that place of writing in terms of more something more familiar and in terms of archetypes, and you can end up somewhere very singular. But I think starting from that place is a really interesting choice, and probably one that would be beneficial to a lot of aspiring writers, because it's easier to find your way into that story than always being worried about how original you're being all the time, I guess.
Right. I mean, it can save a lot of time, certainly. And I mean, if you are writing in a genre, your readers expect you to conform to at least some of the conventions of that genre. You're not going to be able to fool them. They know all about the form that you're working in. So they're going to be judging you, that way as a genre writer. So I'm judged as a writer of noir, as a crime novelist.
Yeah, no. Oh, I was going to say it's also probably inherent to the genre you're working in, and
exactly
crime fiction. No, I think it's really, really cool. What was I going to say?
Yeah. Well, it's also, it might just be the way I am temperamentally.
Yeah.
I need I like to improvise, but I do need some kind of base to work from. I mean, it could just be my personality.
No, but I think that's like, I don't know, you hear like, it's a Miles Davis quote, like you have to learn the rules to forget them. I really think like there is something like basic like kind of plot structure and character archetypes, and just kind of leaning into writing. What we're talking about here is entertainment value, writing, because the reason these things are archetypes, the reason these things are familiar is because they're entertaining. And I think that there's an undervaluation in the pretentious, world of literature. There's and especially, for people who come up through the college system and whatnot, there's an undervaluation, and, God forbid, like critical theory and all that. There's a real undervaluation of reading books because it's entertaining and because it's enjoyable. And that's how you end up with a lot of people. Again, I'm actually, I myself am guilty of this. I end up with a lot of, aspiring writers who are not nearly focused enough on writing an entertaining story, and instead are, again, trying to make these extra literary statements. But yeah, there really is something to the form itself in terms of plot, and I think that maybe that's a strength of your book, and maybe in this whole kind of pulp fiction thing we're talking about in our scene, maybe that's part of what it is kind of a return to just writing enjoyable stuff in a way that a lot of mainstream and pretentious literary circles don't pay enough attention to.
Probably not. I mean, the energy and the vitality of Pulp Fiction is definitely something that I aspire towards in my writing. And what I think ultimately what I do is I start with the feeling, not even with a character or a setting or a central action of the story, just the feeling, and then I use whatever I know of technique, whatever I know of writing fiction to kind of to change things around until I get the feeling where I'm satisfied. So yeah, it's not really so much, the words or the sentences or the paragraphs or the chapters. It's what's going on between the words and the sentences and the paragraphs and the chapters, especially in the form that I'm writing in, which is pretty objective, kind of like a hard-boiled style where it's mostly action, because dialogue is also a type of action. So there's not too much exposition. There's not too much going inside the characters.
Well, yeah, and I think another version of kind of what I said a moment ago is like there's an undervaluation of action in literature. I actually had a professor, not a professor, well, he didn't have a PhD, but he was my writing teacher in college. He was always harping on like, you guys need to make more stuff happen in your stories. Because like there's this tendency for a lot of people in college and maybe just in life now to write these sort of Holden Caulfield-esque protagonists, and they're depressed and nothing happens in their story. But like what he emphasizes, like interesting stories involve externals, not just navel gazing, like people in their own heads, but like stuff happening in the world. And like the more you can suss that out, the more interesting your plot's going to be. Like introspective protagonists are great, but like you need to bring them into the realm of cause and effect. And I do think there's a resistance on the part of a lot of aspiring literary types to do that, both in terms of aspiring writers. But I think this teacher that I had even pointed to like, I'm trying to think of some examples, but even his point was even like a lot of mainstream books are like veering away from just, that good world of that good plot driven world of cause and effect.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I write. It's probably one of the reasons why I chose to write in this genre, because when I was sort of sitting around thinking, well, what am I going to do as a writer? Before I had really published anything, I knew I was going to have to pick something that I wasn't going to get bored with.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'd always been interested in organized crime. I'd always loved noir fiction, noir movies. So that was sort of a no-brainer as to what I was going to write about, long-term as a novelist. Before I'd started writing crime, I was writing, I don't know if it was navel gazing, but yeah, it was pretty experimental, very literary fiction.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't really see where it was going.
Right.
I didn't have the same impetus writing that as I did when I started writing genre fiction. Part of that's probably a legacy in terms of young writers, probably a big part of it's just a legacy of, the 20th century in aesthetic terms didn't end not too long ago. So you had Ulysses, you had the other classics of, stream of consciousness and very interiorized narratives. I like a lot of that stuff, but it's certainly not what I do as a writer.
I think I like a lot of it too. I even like Infinite Jest. Ulysses through like there's the kind of flowering of that up through the 90s. And yeah, it is what we're brought up with. It is what we're told to kind of view as the highest form of literature. Maybe it is, it is very literary, but like I don't want to put myself or any of us down here, but it's like, or any of people in this scene. But maybe one part of it is like it is a very particular kind of genius that makes a book like Ulysses. But like most of us could do better to start, writing something entertaining rather than delving into, stream of con. There's a lot of weird ideas.
Go on, Max.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, well, the main thing is as a writer is just to write something that you would want to read yourself.
Yeah.
Whatever that is, because you need to be engaged with the material as a writer. If you're not engaged with it, it's not going to work.
Yeah,
and the reader's going to sense that pretty quickly. So if, writing a stream of consciousness or, some kind of like avant-garde surrealist masterpiece is what you're engaged with, then, absolutely go for it. But if you're not, you shouldn't feel pressured to have to write something like that, because it's not going to work for anybody, not for you or for the reader.
Yeah, absolutely. My gloss on that is that we all kind of, as writers, have different aptitudes and talents for different types of writing. So you, like you say, you should naturally pursue the writing that you enjoy, that you are good at. And it doesn't mean that like literary fiction is like better than genre fiction. The same way it doesn't mean that like, I don't know, one type of cuisine is better than another type of cuisine, or one type of kind of like lifters are better than runners or whatever.
Yeah.
Like it's just, people are different and styles are different. And that's like, frankly, on New Right, we're champions of diversity here. So we enjoy diversity of literary styles. And Yeah. So I think there's a lot to be said about well-written pulp, which certainly your novel is. And to dig back into it a little deeper, we I wanted to get more into McDougal, and especially he is, you know, a man of God in his own mind. I think perhaps he honestly believes himself to be a religious man. I don't have basis for saying that other than the general kind of sense I got from the narrative. But he also obviously objectively is a cult leader. He's a psychopath. He's a bit of a sadist, and so I think this is another archetypal character in Pulp Fiction, but in other genres as well. The kind of religious psychopath, and so how did you okay, here's like from the notes literally. Um are religious leaders always cultists in a certain sense? Does an aptitude for religion kind of coincide with an aptitude for controlling people and for kind of and in fact that is always something that corrupts somewhat. If you are have the ability to control people, you will have certain temptations that go along with that.
Yeah, that's a great question because I'm not sure that I have an answer to that one. I mean, certainly, manipulative cult-like behaviors in religion have, that coincided for a long time and, are still prevalent, in today's world. If there is one disclaimer I want to make on the book is it doesn't represent my feelings about religion or organized religion in any way. McDougal, if he was an actual, Christian, it would be some kind of extreme, millennialist kind of group like the Branch Davidians or something like that. So it doesn't really reflect my feelings about, Christianity or religion. But certainly with him, he does. The thing about him is, yeah, exactly what you're talking about, Dan, is that he does believe all this stuff. He does believe that the world is ending, and he believes that he's the only one who can, interpret Revelation and everything. So he knows who's being saved, who's not being saved. And he uses that knowledge to manipulate the people around him. That's certainly true with Timmy, who looks up to him as, his father figure.
Yeah. And he, in a very interesting way, is always, and in a way that's actually somewhat similar to the protagonist of my own novel, he is always able to spin whatever happens as though it were always meant to have been that way. And so when like certain events, I don't want to give any spoilers in your novel, but certain events happen and he's just like, well, God willed it to happen. And it's like, well, you kind of fucked up and caused it. But it's an interesting, character type where they can kind of assimilate any sort of defeat into a larger psychological victory because their plan is proceeding apace, shall we say.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you brought that up because I did actually read Nutcracker this week.
Oh, great!
For the podcast, yeah. So there are probably some Spencer-esque qualities, and there, and it can be very good for comedy. Obviously, with God as a Killer, it's very black comedy.
Yeah.
So but yeah, I definitely understand what you're talking about.
Yeah. Being able to spin any humiliation or defeat into victory just around the corner.
Yeah,
right.
It's an interesting trait in literature and in life. I think it's founded in fundamental, not like obsessive compulsive disorder, but a lot of us and a lot of characters in fiction. There's this tendency to find, to create meaning, like both. Like in life and when you're writing, like everyone wants to kind of assimilate all of that into one broad narrative. And in terms of religion, I recognizing that your novel doesn't reflect, your feelings on organized religion per se, but I do think it highlights not something that's true about all religion or all religious people everywhere, but it's an interesting kind of psychological case study of the way that religion can be used. And it's twofold in the discussion that we've just had. Like, not only religion can be used to kind of bolster power and being a religious figure and putting yourself up on a pedestal can very much be a way to justify your own power, perhaps even your own sadism, in the case of the character in your book. But also it can involve this kind of narrative. I think about this a lot, like this narrative creating element where religion can be a way to kind of give mystical significance to, as you said, every event, even humiliating, obvious setbacks, can be kind of assimilated into a greater narrative of meaning and of progress toward progress toward a concrete goal. And as you guys mentioned, it's something that's in both Nutcracker and God is a Killer, and it's kind of this interesting thing. There's a power to that. We almost want to see, like, I think that some people in life and in literature use that to as motivation to keep going, almost like and that can be very necessary in a sometimes chaotic world, but then it also can lead to lunacy and dramatic irony, which are entertaining. It's just interesting. It's just an interesting psychological element there.
Yeah, well, I think that I finally got around to watching Dune last weekend.
Nice.
I loved it.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that Herbert said about writing Dune, I mean, obviously it goes a lot into the psychology of power, and power politics, is that he pointed out, well, it's positions of power in themselves that attract pathological people.
Mm-hmm.
So you're never going to have a perfect society, because on the one hand, you do need some kind of division of labor or people in positions of power to make sure that there is order, that things do function, that things actually get done. On the other hand, having those positions in the first place is going to attract the worst sorts of people towards them, because they're looking for an outlet for their sadism, for all their unpleasant qualities. So that's just, to me, that's just part of human life. That's going to be part of any society that you can think of.
Yeah.
Which I think Pulp highlights so well, because this focus on moral ambiguity, the idea that, like, essentially, if you're acting at all in the world, you have your own agenda. And, even if you're acting in the name of good, there's no one who is like God, who is perfect. So everyone, even if you're acting in the name of good, you're acting also in the name of yourself. And all carry all your vices with you. And so, yeah, I think that Pulp boils down to like these great morality plays, because they center a sort of moral ambiguity that is centered in God is a Killer, in the cat and mouse game between Fitzroy and McDougal, and even between the long-suffering homeowner and her. She appears to be not entirely blameless either. It seems as though she co-signed on some, tragedies of some sort, and perhaps she was coerced into them. But I think you do a good job of painting a morally murky and ambiguous world. And like, how central do you think that is to the experience of Pulp Fiction?
I think, well, Pulp, it's a pretty broad field, so it depends on kind of what we mean by pulp, because you have, a lot of the classic pulp writers who are, writing what were basically action heroes. And there's not as much moral ambiguity in those stories. But on the noir side, on the crime side, yeah, it's rife. And that's sort of the side of pulp that I was drawn to. All the great pulp writers, and Jim Thompson in particular, he's the dime store Dostoevsky. So he was the reason why I started writing crime fiction. I read Pop 1280 and thought, I need to get in on this, because, this is right up my alley. And I could see myself doing this, as a novelist.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, in writing noir, I mean, if it's not morally ambivalent or doesn't have morally ambivalent characters, it's probably not noir. There's quite a lot of bit of that today. It's commercial fiction with noir trappings. Sort of like Hallmark Channel noir. Where,
like, what would you, not to, if you don't want to name any names, that's fine. But like, what's an example of fake noir that's being pushed today?
Fake noir. It could just be that we see the genre very differently. And, I don't really want to name names or anything, but
yeah, don't want to start.
It's pretty clear that,
right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't belong to that group. So I'm kind of, I'm with Apocalypse Confidential. You can see what we're about, what we do.
I
So
get you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fake. No, I don't even want to name names either. But you see this a lot with the kind of Netflixication of everything. I don't know if this is specifically what you're talking about, Max. It's kind of an aside, but there's a lot of genre aesthetics get recycled in kind of bullshit packages. Maybe we can leave it at that. I call them.
No, Netflixication is a good term for it, because a lot of the stuff that I've read, it was like it was written just to be adapted by Netflix. Like that's why they wrote the novel.
Yeah. Like
it's very odd when you read that too. It's kind of like an uncanny valley effect where
Yeah.
none of the characters seem like real characters. They're just, it was just written to attempt to get some kind of deal. Like it could be the author doesn't really even care that much about crime fiction. They just want to be an author or whatever. So
no, you definitely
I try to stay away from stuff like that.
Yeah, no, totally. No, it's out there, in literature and then in movies. Yeah, Netflix. I do think Netflixification kind of gets to it. I think a good example of it is kind of what happened with the show Black Mirror, how it kind of used to be more, and our friend Last Things did a YouTube series on this, how it started off kind of as this dark science fiction, and then when Netflix took it over, I mean, not only is it woke, it just, it's like it gets all of the life drained out of it, but we can probably leave it at that.
I think we're in agreement about this.
Yeah, I think we all know like the flattening effect of being part of a mass cultural organization and a multinational company with the sensibilities today. You're just like, the ability to express truth goes away, and so too does the ability to create art. Mm-hmm. Moving on to we wanted to dig in a bit to the New England setting, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording. But what drew you to set the novel in New Hampshire, and what drew you to kind of like that area in general? Because when I think of noir, I think, and maybe I'm not as educated as some in the genre, but I think of kind of like cityscapes. I think of San Francisco or New York or something like that.
Yeah, that's another good question. It's not the White Mountains where the book takes place isn't that far from where I live now, which is just outside of Boston. It's probably about a 2-hour drive. And, I've been up there quite a few times, a couple of times just to go up there pretty much and just take notes and look around and make sure I was, getting some good details into the novel, because again, like I said, it's not very far away, but, I didn't grow up in that area and I don't live there every day. So I wanted to at least make sure it was plausible. And, some of the best, praise that I've gotten for the book was from people who live in that area or from northern New England. And they said, yeah, this is awesome. You incorporate all the stuff that's in our everyday lives that we don't see in a lot of other fiction. Certainly not crime fiction. So that's been
amazing.
Really, really nice. Yeah. But yeah, like you said, it's also different from what, someone who's read my short stories would probably think, because my short stories are mostly about urban crime in and around Boston. Whereas this takes place, up in the woods. So it is a little bit different in that. And the project that I'm working on now is much more urban than rural. So, I might come back to the rural noir thing again. But for now, this is kind of like my take on it. It's encapsulated in this book.
I feel like, and this is something that's not exactly in the notes, but I'm just kind of running with it. I feel like in this kind of late capitalism in America and the Western world, like the rural settings actually seem like a better setting for noir type fiction. Because so you have like rusting factory towns, you have like all this tragedy inherent in the very landscape. So when I think of some of like the better movies that have come out recently, Out of the Furnace, Killing Them Softly, it's about like rural American noir, and it's just this kind of very ripe setting for the clash between good and evil and the various conflicts of our time too.
Sure, yeah, Out of the Furnace, definitely. And I think if I'm thinking of an older film, that's probably A Simple Plan. Did you ever see that?
I did, yeah.
So
I like that a lot.
I think I saw that at an impressionable age, and it probably had a big effect on me. I need to read the book that's based on. I've still never read it, but yeah, I love that movie. And I mean, if there is kind of a guiding spirit behind the book, it would probably be Jim Thompson, because, a hyper-violent rural noir with a corrupt county sheriff is very much up his alley. So he was a big influence on the book.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like today, God, like so many of the the stories that would be stereotypically noir type stories, with anti-heroes, working, fighting against the establishment and kind of like corrupt cops chasing them. Now that seems like, well, a situation where you have kind of returned veterans home and, authorities who are, maybe not entirely sympathetic and all sorts of, it just seems like a great setting now that I think about it.
Rural, yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting point, Dan. I mean, Max, I admit I haven't read your short stories. I'd like to check them out, but it sounds like you write both kind of the urban angle on crime as well as the rural area, rural angle. But yeah, no, I think Dan, you definitely bring up an interesting point. I mean, more obviously, there's always been rural crime, and there's always that, but like really, yeah, post 1990s Rust Belt is kind of a novel historical moment for this kind of crime literature, I think.
Yeah, like I mean, I feel like the people, and this is not to denigrate, urban noir, but when I think of the people in cities, I think of like bugmen and crazy homeless people.
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking too.
That's, whereas like kind of these shadowy heroic figures, like I don't see too many heroic figures on the subway with me in
Right.
New York. I see like kind of scared bugmen and I
Yeah.
guess like the homeless are kind of heroic in a weird way, but
Uh-huh. Well,
yeah,
here's a
they're
way of
definitely more anti-heroes and
here's a way of
some
framing this.
respects.
Would there be a Dirty Harry on the San Francisco Police Department force now? I don't think so. So yeah, go figure.
Yeah. I mean, you might have a Dirty Harry, citizen vigilante, perhaps.
Have to be that, yeah.
But
Yeah, well, I mean, no place is really isolated anymore, but I mean, you have a bit more leeway in a rural setting, because you don't have, the eye of Sauron on you, at all times.
Exactly. That's
So, you can get, I mean, yeah, there's still, you can't get away with quite as much as you used to, but yeah, as a literary setting, there are a lot of possibilities.
Yeah. And there's again, I know you've said the book is not political and whatnot, and I definitely respect that. And I don't think it is, but nevertheless, I would also add that in a rural setting, you can kind of just lean into something that feels a little more vital, not so much politically proper, but just sociologically about, the state of the United States as it is now. There's that kind of implicit like sense of rural decay, which is a lot more interesting right now than urban decay. We all know about urban decay, but what's happened kind of to quote unquote flyover country over the past 30 years, well, we all kind of know about that too, but nevertheless, I think it's a much more vital backdrop in this day and age.
Yeah, and if someone has a political take on the book from, whatever stripe, that's fine with me. And I think, probably whatever political feelings that I have, or, meta political feelings about human nature or human behavior, are all in the book, but they're impossible for me to paraphrase, which is probably why, I write fiction and why I wrote God is a Killer in the first place. Because there are things that I can't really say in a conversation. I can't articulate them in the same way. There's an emotional quality behind them that has to go into a long form narrative.
Completely. Well, I very, very much respect that. And look, this is new, right? So obviously we always kind of had a little bit of a sometimes tongue in cheek, but sometimes pretty sincere political angle on our podcast. But look, I mean, especially over the past 2 years, like more and more, I have absolutely nothing to say about matters of obvious political significance or electoral politics. And more, I think that, most of the political thoughts I have are, as you said, metapolitical takes on human nature and sociological sort of more metapolitical thoughts that I do think are much better explored aesthetically and in literature. Again, this is new, right? We've kind of branded ourselves with that, but yeah, man, I don't necessarily want to talk about, this or that in relation to what Biden's doing. I'm much more interested in, as you said.
Yeah, no, well, I think that I'm a fan of the podcast, and I think that what you guys have done is great. And you've had a lot of great guests on top of that. A lot of great writers. I just think that, I mean, the meta political stuff is so important because those are how you get political systems in the first place.
Exactly.
If they're all based on, well, what is or what is bad for people. I mean, these questions have to be answered beforehand, and you really are looking at human nature and human behavior before you're looking at, the budget or whatever, people are supposed to be arguing about in terms of politics.
Right. Well, that right there is kind of my political take on things right now. I mean, from like a quote unquote right wing perspective, it's like obviously, Trump out of the picture, Biden, it's kind of this. I'm very much bored kind of with what, and disheartened by with what's going on a mainstream political level. So it's almost like we need to think about, and people like BAP on our corner Twitter and others talk about this, like you have to kind of readdress those foundational questions, because whatever comes next politically, it's going to be something new, and it has to start with this kind of consideration, I think, and literature and art can play a role in that. So this has been absolutely my conviction anyway.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
So I think this might be a good part to discuss the history of noir fiction and some of your favorites today, some of your favorites in the past. And so I've always enjoyed Elmer Leonard, which I imagine is probably a favorite of sorts of yours as well, just because he's such a big guy. James Ellroy. But then, moving more to the more distant past, Raymond Chandler and others. Who are your favorites, Max?
Well, yeah, I love both Leonard and Ellroy. In terms of my personality, I'm much closer to Leonard than I am to Ellroy, just as a person and as a writer, I think. And he was a big influence on me. And that was actually how I met Dawson online. Is that we both liked Elmore Leonard.
Yeah,
so that was so that was how I met him, and that's how I later got involved with the cast of characters at Apocalypse Confidential. I write in a pretty sparse, pretty hard-boiled style. It's not that literary, if you read it. And for me, that really starts with Dashiell Hammett at Black Mass. And of course he's tremendous, like legendary novelist. He wrote Red Harvest, Maltese Falcon, Glass Key. So he was a huge influence on me. And then he had a successor at Black Mask called Paul Kane, who wrote a book called Fast One. And he's even more hard-boiled than Dashiell Hammett. So he was another big influence on me. And I think that what I took from those guys most of all was speed of narrative. I couldn't believe how much action Dashiell Hammett could compress into 15 or 20 pages. I'd never seen anything like it. So that was a huge influence on me and had a huge impact on the way that I write and how I see literature. Awesome. Going kind of moving forward in time, I like some of the mid-century noir authors like Jim Thompson, Charles Willeford. There's a lot of humor in what they did. A lot of black humor, almost of the, like Nathaniel West school, petty sadism and, lots of, murder and stuff. And then I think sort of where I really come into the writers who influenced me is probably late 60s, early 70s, because you had an entire generation of writers. You had George V. Higgins, who wrote Friends of Eddie Coyle, and Kogan's Trade.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Killing Him Softly is based on. Yeah. And he was born the next town over from where I live. He was born in Rockton. I live in Stoughton, so he's, he lived in this area his whole life. I also write about the Boston underworld, and I use lots of dialogue. So he's influenced me, and he was also a primary influence on Elmore Leonard. Higgins was the reason Leonard went from writing Westerns to writing crime fiction after he read Friends of Eddie Coyle.
Dang.
Which is funny because their sensibilities are totally different, because Higgins is extremely grim and, and very black. And then with Leonard, you get a lot more humor. It's a bit more lighthearted. You're laughing at these criminals a lot of the time because you can't believe like what they're getting themselves into.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say Higgins, and then Donald Goines.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Donald Goines. And then another guy who's not talked about as much, Shane Stevens. He wrote a
Yeah, I
book called,
haven't heard of him.
yeah, he wrote a book called Dead City, which has been out of print for a long time, but for me is probably the best mobster gangster novel that's ever been written by anybody, including The Godfather, or Little Caesar, or any of the other great ones. I wish it was back in print so more people could read it.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe that is a mission for Apocalypse Confidential to get those rights.
That would be a dream. I've sort of looked into it. From what I've heard, is that the his estate is not interested in, or whoever has the rights to the book is not interested in letting anybody publish it.
That's too
At least
bad.
for the time being. So
Yeah,
who knows? Maybe that'll change in the future.
Now I have to ask you, what is your favorite Elmer Leonard novel?
That's a good question. I was actually talking about this with a mutual online not too long ago. I think from his 70s period, I'd have to say Swag. That was his little more kind of like his gritty Detroit period.
I'm not sure I read that one. I went through a period when I was like 12, when I was reading all these Elmer Leonard books. I guess I was a bit precocious in that regard. And I remember really liking Kill Shot.
Kill Shot's great.
Yeah, and Freaky Deaky.
Yeah, I read Freaky Deaky. That I don't think that was up there with Kill Shot for me. If I did think of three, probably off the top of my head, I would say Swag, Kill Shot, and Get Shorty.
Okay, yeah.
Get Shorty is great. And so is the movies is great too.
Yeah, they adapt so well to film, which is like, as you say, it is a type of narrative that focuses on action. So it's very easy to not easy, but it's a good fit for adaptation to film.
No, exactly. I think that Leonard to film conversion is it's like it might be like maybe not as high as Stephen King, but I don't know. It's I don't want to name a number because I'm probably wrong. It's upwards of a dozen or more, maybe even like 20 movies that have been made or TV. You know, so many adaptations, and they're still being made.
I mean,
tons and tons.
Out of Sight, I think, is probably my favorite. I would say Out of Sight is probably my favorite Leonard adaptation.
I think I'd have to go with Jackie Brown. That's probably number one for me.
Yeah, I forgot that was
that was really good too.
And that shows you how similar, how much Tarantino took from Leonard. Because Tarantino's one record is saying that he doesn't make noir films.
Oh, wow.
He makes sort of like twisted crime films, sort of the way that Charles Willeford and Carl Hyacin will write a crime novel. They'll just, the more outrageous they make it, the better. And I remember reading an interview with him where he mentioned those two writers in particular, along with Leonard, because there isn't a lot of moral ambiguity, not so much in.
I tend to agree, actually. Yeah, that it's not so much noir, with the exception maybe of Jackie Brown.
Yeah, I mean it's there is some noir in there, but he's
not totally. Yeah,
it's not. It doesn't have the same murkiness.
No, I think that's
you
fair.
would get from like a classic noir.
Fair characterization. I just looked this up because I was curious. This is just from Wikipedia, but we're at like about 23 Elmer Leonard adaptations for TV.
Wow, that's impressive.
And I know I've seen, I know they're still being made. Like you see scripts kicking around. It's like, this is going to get made. So yeah, no, he's very adaptable. I had one random question. Have you ever read the book Another Day in Paradise by Eddie Little?
Good question.
Is that the one that the Larry Clark film is based on?
Yes.
It is. Yeah.
Okay. I've seen the movie, but I haven't read the book.
I'm the opposite. I read the book, haven't seen the movie. I surprisingly haven't seen the movie. Just a very random. I'm not well read in crime fiction. I would like to read more of it, but that's one that I've read that I enjoyed. And in particular, there's a character, I don't know if he ended up in the movie, but there's a character in Another Day in Paradise who kind of has a similar thing going on with religion as your character, where he's like a criminal and essentially uses, quotes from Revelation and other parts of the Bible to justify his violence. It's kind of a thing you see in a lot of crime fiction, I think. I just was curious if you'd read it, but.
No, I hadn't, but yeah, like I said, he's kind of McDougal's an archetypal character in some ways. He has lots of similarities with other characters. And Night of the Hunter, I think, was probably the biggest influence on the novel. Have you seen Night of the Hunter?
I have not.
Yeah, well, if I'm thinking of my three favorite noir films, they're all really easy for me to name because they all have Robert Mitchum in them. So that's Out of the Past, Night of the Hunter, and then Friends of Eddie Coyle.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, Eddie Coyle is on my list.
Yeah,
but I should put the others on there too.
Yeah.
With regard to film, I was wondering, it seems there's like similarly to how online there's a resurgence of interest in noir fiction. It seems like there's a resurgence of interest in noir film, and so you have like The Nice Guys. You have other kind of films that are coming out, in past few years now. Like, what is your sense of the kind of resurgence of the noir theme in contemporary cinema?
Well, it could just be that it's time and that we're going through another cycle, but it's also easy to get into because so much of it's just good. There have been lots of great noir films. A lot of them have lots of style, great characters, lots of action. So it's like, what's there not to like?
Yeah,
I mean, the influence that Drive has had on popular culture over the past 10 years is remarkable.
absolutely.
Seeing that in the theater, I would never predicted that. And Refn just had his latest project come out, but Copenhagen Cowboy, which I haven't seen.
I haven't, but yeah.
Yeah, I need to see that. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm all for it because I write noir, and if it's noir, that could only be good for me. So, but I'll be writing noir, regardless. It doesn't really matter.
Excellent. Well, our kind of last question here, though we can keep talking for longer, but the last one that we noted on our notes is Max Thrax. Now, he is it an homage to the Roman emperor? Where at what point did you decide to call yourself Max Thrax?
I don't remember the exact moment I decided that, but it does come from him. I mean, I love reading about the Roman Empire, reading Roman history, and I've been influenced by a lot of ancient Roman writers. As a prose stylist. So I'm thinking of some off the top of my head. I mean, I would say Cato the Elder. He wrote a book about agriculture that, if you read it, it's the most sparse, hard-boiled prose, the most thing you've ever read in your life. And it's just this guy talking about how to set up your little, farm in the countryside. So I love that. Yeah, and then you've got some of the great, more well-known historians like Tacitus, Sallust, and actually right now I'm re-listening to an audio book of Caesar's Gallic War.
Yeah,
he was. I mean, it seems almost unfair that Julius Caesar should also be, one of the greatest prose stylists ever, but it's a fact.
Yeah.
So I try not to get too down about that, but I mean, it's an amazing book. He was a big influence on my style, just so direct, so vigorous. It's a lot of the things that I want to be as a writer. So he's the guy I keep coming back to.
Yeah, I not found out about Caesar, found out about his writing from the Good Old Boys podcast. And I had no idea that he had, written the Gallic Wars and was such a great prose stylist. And it's been on my list to dig into it. And I've heard it's very rewarding.
Yeah, I think you'll dig it. As far as Max Thrax, he was known as being one of the less impressive emperors. He was, known for being the soldier emperor. So
he was known for being gigantic, though, right?
Yeah, he was huge. Well, he was, Thrax means he's from Thrace, so he was from, this wild place.
Yeah.
North of Greece. If you read, Greek tragedy, sometimes they'll use Thrace as a figure of speech, like, there's some wild stuff, going on up there. We're not so savage as, the people up there. So all those connotations I like. Just, just the ironic thing that, he was a Roman emperor, but he wasn't really that great.
But he was a beast.
He was a beast of a man, that's for sure.
There we go. Well, I guess go on. I'm sorry.
I was curious, just given the New England setting of it all, and also he is, I believe, name dropped on Apocalypse Confidential's website, is H.P. Lovecraft. Now, this wouldn't come through so textually because it's a very, very different genre, but I'm just curious if you're just based on the New England of it all, if you're a Lovecraft fan.
Yeah, I am a Lovecraft fan. I don't write horror or, even like cosmic horror or anything like that, but some of that, the cosmic terror, it can be, kind of infused.
I think it is.
Yeah, it's very, very subtle. But yeah, it is. I'm glad that you spotted that because it is there at a very subtle level. Yeah. And that does have just something to do with, I think, how old New England is, that it was, one of the first places that the English came. When they came over here, and to them, it just seemed like this, vast, imposing forest. If you read, I think it's in the stage directions for The Crucible, it mentions the fact that the Puritans saw the New World as, the Satan's citadel. You know, they thought that all kinds of stuff were going on in the woods out there. And if you go to the woods in New England today, I mean, they're still pretty dark.
Yeah.
I think this was sort of a controversial subject online a little while ago about the New England landscape and about how scary and imposing it is. And, you know, it's all true. You know, I can only confirm that.
No, I've
Yeah.
spent limited time in New England, but I have a similar impression for sure. And I do think that kind of worldview is suffused definitely into your work, playing out through the New England setting and God is a Killer. But even you could probably even make the argument in noir in general. There's that almost Gnostic sense that kind of Dan you alluded to earlier, where it's like, you know, the realm of human affairs is tainted. Everyone is tainted by their own self-interest, and there's this great darkness and sadism that comes through. Not exactly what Lovecraft was writing about, but there's a darkness to it that I think ends up suffused.
Right, and obviously, Hawthorne, you know, that was a major, you know, subject in his own writing. You know, original sin, and actually, the town where I'm in now, Stoughton, is named after the Chief Justice of the Salem witch trials.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's you know, things are still pretty old and eerie around here.
Yeah, definitely. Well,
spooky times.
Yep.
Well, all right. On that note, do you have any additional items you'd like to hit, or?
No, other than thanking both of you for having me on here.
Absolutely.
You know, novel,
thank you for coming on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. My novel, God is a Killer, is published by Close to the Bone. It's available on Amazon, in ebook and in print. And check out Apocalypse Confidential, which is apocalypse-confidential.com. We've got our love special coming out next month, so be sure to look out for that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you got to check out Apocalypse Confidential. These guys put out an awesome magazine. The art is amazing. The stories and reviews and everything are amazing. And, you know, Max, his novel is just honestly a page turner. I went through it very quickly because I was just so sucked into the kind of dark and very entertaining world that you created, Max. So
great. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for coming on.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime.
Yeah, great to talk to you. I'm sure we'll talk more in the future.
All right, sounds good.
Take care.
All right, you guys take it easy.
Bye.